So to understand Husain the man, we need to go back to Husain the small boy, growing up under the influence of the Prophet in his own home. We know that the Prophet always had a very close relationship with the two young boys when they were small. He loved to have them around him. He would often sit and play with them when they were small babies. And as they grew and were able to move around, he loved to have them with him, perhaps sitting in his lap. Sometimes we're told that he would be in the mosque and he would be giving a talk, and suddenly he would see the boys arrive and he would call them to him. And they would come forward and they would sit one on each knee, and they would remain there while he was speaking to the assembly. He called them, after the manner of the time, his sons, not his grandsons, but his sons. So close was the relationship, the proximity between the Prophet and the two boys. We know that on one occasion, one of them crawled up onto his back when he was in prostration during prayer, and the Prophet paused there until he had come high enough to be able to hold on to the Prophet's shoulders, and then the Prophet took his two hands, and when he came up, he held them so that he could ride his back after that for the rest of the prayer. Such was the closeness of the Prophet and the two of them. Now, the Prophet, of course, knew that these two were to be part of the Ahlulbayt, part of those who would succeed him after his own death and after their death of the father Ali. So that he was always having that in mind in training their characters, that they should be full of that zeal, full of that understanding, which was to be their duty and their vocation. Now, although the two boys were very small, they nevertheless have a very close relationship with God from the beginning, because their call to imamate begins from the very moment of their birth. They are filled with a spiritual excellence which brings them into a close relationship with God. This means that even incidents that happen when they're still quite young have a profound influence and enable them to reflect and to learn from those in a way much quicker and much deeper than most of us would at that same age. So I want to look at two incidents in the early life of the two boys so that we can see something of their character in the process of formation. I want to look at the incident of the thorough purification of the Ahlulbayt. We're told that the Prophet was wrapped in a large cloak or a blanket, and then he called under that cloak successively Ali, Fatima, Hassan, and Husain, so that these five were together under the blanket. Now, the boys were quite small at this time, and yet they were aware that they were drawn into this familial embrace under the blanket. And then the verse of the Quran was revealed that Allah wished to purify the Ahlulbayt, the household of the Prophet, with the most thorough purification. Now, only God can thoroughly purify to the ultimate degree, because only God is ultimately pure, is ultimately the highest of spiritual excellence. In this case then, the two boys, even though they were small, were aware of a kind of spiritual infusion, a lifting of their souls in this divine embrace. Now, I'm sure that as they grew up, Ali and Fatima would have helped them to understand the importance of this experience and the fact that these five are the kernel of the Ahlulbayt, and that the children of this family going down through the generations will be the leaders of the community, divinely appointed by God. Another event that I want to look at, and this is an event that took place shortly before the death of the Prophet. It was the event of the visit of the delegation from Najan. Here was a Christian delegation who came to Medina to engage with the Prophet in conversation about the person of Jesus. They did not manage to resolve their differences, and in the end, a verse of the Quran was revealed, which was commanding them to mubahala, to mutual cursing before God. And so they were to appear, the two groups, in the next morning and to invoke the curse of God upon whichever one of them was not telling the truth. They were commanded to bring ourselves, our women, and our sons. When the Prophet appeared for the mubahala, he came with Ali, whom he referred to as his nafs, or his very self, and he came with Fatima, his daughter, the mother of the two boys, and he came with Hassan and Husain. So the five of them appeared together, and at this, the Christian delegation, we're told, decided that it would not be a good idea to take on in mutual cursing the Prophet and his immediate family. Because if the Prophet was prepared to risk the whole of his immediate family in this mutual cursing, then clearly, they said, this was not something into which we should go. And again, we can see that the two boys would be questioning their father Ali later on, wanting to know what all this was about, wanting to gain a deeper understanding and insight into what happened. After the death of the Prophet, and shortly afterwards, the death of the mother of the two boys, Lady Fatima, it was Ali who became the most important influence in the life of the two young boys. Now, Ali, we know, also grew up in the shadow of the Prophet. He was the closest to him throughout those years growing up. He was modeling his life on the Prophet, and we know that the Quran tells us, you have in the Prophet the most beautiful example of how a godly life should be lived. So Ali models his life upon the perfect example of the Prophet, and Ali then becomes the trainer of the characters of the two boys.